It was spring. The daffodils had long since disappeared from the banks of the Doubs. It was spring and time to leave. The Allisons, the Dauphines, the Donzels, and many others had packed up their bags and were waiting in silence on a quay in Rotterdam. From 1749 to 1752, there were 431 Montbeliardian subjects of the Duke of Württemberg who set sail for Canada to found Halifax and Lunenburg on the shores of Nova Scotia with other immigrants. The trip was long, more than 100 days at sea. But after the fatigue, the deprivation, the illness, a new life and 50 acres of land were waiting for each fit man. Two and a half centuries later, Marie-Thérèse and Pierre Jodry had a first contact with these cousins for the least unexpected.
Exactly 15 years ago yesterday, an unknown man, unknown to us and to everybody in the village, came into Montbeliard. He arrived at the castle of Montbeliard and asked whether any Jodry was known hereabouts. Actually, his name Jodry was slightly deformed. Over there, it's Jodway because of the English influence. He met a lot of people who told him, I know one Jodry here, or I know one Jodry there. They found nothing precise when suddenly a woman, or rather two women, said, listen, I know one Jodry who lives in Audincourt. I can drive you there. And that was the beginning of our relationship with our cousins from over there.
In Lunenburg, the memory is still alive, and the Montbeliardians' names and the names of the ships which with they arrived are carved in stone.
The original Dauphiny who came here in 1753 was a man by the name of Jean. I believe he was just a farmer, and the original grandfather and great-grandfather of myself, they inherited the property of the original John Dauphiny. And that property is 4 miles from here, in a community called Northwest and Faubourg.
George Frederick Bailey in 1753.
Okay.
From Montbeliard. Well, when they arrived here, they were teachers, educational teachers for the settlers that came here, but they are also farmers, I believe.
Well, Jean-Christophe came from Allendon.
Allendon.
Right.
Okay. And you, Mildred?
Well, I don't believe we know where the Vinos came from.
He came as a farmer. And as far as I know, that's all he did, was farm.
Okay, and you, Mildred?
Leopold Vino came and as a farmer.
Those who are named today Montbeliardians were real pioneers. staking their future on an uncertain adventure, only hanging on to life by their flawless determination.
I think they were more just simple, plain, ordinary people. They came to Nova Scotia looking for perhaps a better way of life, looking for the opportunity to have large farms or start new businesses in a new country.
I don't think of them as heroes, no, but people who brought with them a determination to succeed, a faith in their God, which allowed them to trust and to have hope, because it had to be very difficult for them in those earlier years. But they withstood all those trials and those testings and were able to, in that sense, they were heroes. They were victors. They overcame.
You know, you see people dying very young. You know, obviously you had more people dying in the first 6 months or the first 2 years of their life than we do have now. So they had large families, but in many of these large families they lost a lot of their children, you know, early on.
And also at the beginning their freedom was restrained because they had to stay inside a place where the militia could protect them from the Indians. And then the government would give them a bit more land, you know, and they could go a bit further. So they had to fight for more land always, more territory. And some of them sometimes would say, okay, I want this land there, but it was unprotected. And we know a bit from reading, you know, and some of it is more legend, but some of it is a bit of history. And sometimes a family were going a bit outside what was protected, and then they would get killed, or, you know, things like that would happen, you know.
Now, speaking of dangers to the people in those early days, it was quite common for Indians to attack them. One family, the Peasant family, were raided by the Indians. One evening, there was a sound outside, and Mrs. Peasant went to the door and opened the door. There were Indians there. They shot her husband, and scalped him. They killed the maid, and they took Mrs. Peasant and her children and took them all the way to Quebec. And they were kept there for several years before they found their way back to Nova Scotia. So there were hardships like this in Lunenburg in the very early days. But peace was soon made with the Indians, and that kind of thing ceased.
And many of the people who had been on the ship from Europe, from Rotterdam, for as much as 2.5 and 3 months. And many of them had run out of good food and water, and therefore they arrived in a weakened condition. Many of them caught epidemic diseases once they arrived, and since they were weak, many of them died. Those who survived and came over here working on these defenses, they were being constantly assaulted and harassed by Indians. The Indians at that time in Nova Scotia, the Micmac Indians, at that time were in alliance with King Louis of France against the settlement of the English and the other Protestants in this region. So they were introduced here as part of the replacement population for the English people who deserted. And they settled in first Halifax, then in Lunenburg. Later, from Lunenburg, they moved out into other areas of the province. In 1780, they moved some from Lunenburg to where you were this morning, along the shore of St. Margaret's Bay to Peggy's Cove in that area. But most of the Montbeliard people and their descendants stayed in Halifax and Lunenburg areas.
And Jack Ruagek Rollin Steel Gunt Corn a Beast and Taki Shown Nura Yiket Yehen Yowel had Gakit Morning.
In order to determine which piece of land each person would receive, they took playing cards. They had surveyed the town, and they had given each piece of land a number. And they wrote the number on the back of the playing cards. The playing cards were then put in a hat or a box, and each person reached in and took out a card. And the number of the land that was on the card was the piece of land they received in the town of Lunenburg. We are standing now on the piece of land, the lot that was granted to Jean-Christophe Gaudry in the early days of the founding of Lunenburg. Now, it is rather interesting that in this particular block, there was land for 14 families. And within 10 to 15 years after coming here, Jean-Christophe had bought 7 of the lots in this particular block. In addition to that, each person received a garden lot just outside town so they could grow their vegetables. They were also given a 30-acre lot way out in the country where they would later establish a farm.
And Jack Ruagek Rollin Steel Gunt Corn a Beast and Taki Shown.
We can understand why ancestry has become such a passion for this community. This research of identity, which uses the most modern means, especially computers, concerns all the generations and throws bridges over the Atlantic.
Mary Dorothea Gaudry, J-O-D-R-Y. She was born the 6th of September 1799 in Maitland in Lunenburg County, Nova Scotia.
I am Nova Scotian, I am Montbeliardian, I am Canadian. But when I am in Montbeliard, I am always Montbeliardian.
Hi, John, David, Murray. I'm sure we'll see each other again one day, maybe to search for Captain Kidd's treasure on Oak Island. I know you have only left Ontario and our legends to taste the magic of new spaces. But for us, from the old Europe, you are Montbeliardians forever.